Summer of 1290. The mouth of the Thames reeks of mud and sewage, and the wharves are packed tighter than the port wardens have seen in years. Hundreds of people, bundles on their backs, children in their arms, eyes fixed on the planks beneath their feet, are cramming onto chartered ships. They are not sailors. Most have never seen the open sea. They have until the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, to disappear from the island. Anyone who stays loses their head. On the 18th of July, King Edward I of England signed the Edict of Expulsion. The date was deliberate. In the Hebrew calendar, it fell on the 9th day of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning commemorating the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem. To give you a sense of the mood, one example: the captain of one of the ships collected his fare from a group of exiles, then deliberately ran his vessel aground on a sandbar at low tide near Queenborough at the mouth of the Thames. He convinced his passengers to step onto the exposed sand. A stroll, stretch your legs, and when the water began to rise, he pulled up the gangway and sailed off. A chronicle from Osney Abbey preserved his words. He shouted at the drowning passengers to pray to their Moses to part the waters for them. They drowned. Edward I had the captain caught and punished. A noble gesture? No. Court records are explicit. The captain was convicted of stealing property belonging to the crown, not for taking lives, for theft. Because in medieval England, Jews, their bodies, homes, money, promissory notes, were the legal property of the king. Literally. Some dockside hustler drowning them was a crime against the state budget. And that is what this episode is about. Not about hatred, not about religion. This episode is about money, about debt, about an arrangement where every side gained something and every side lost something, except the costs were never shared equally. Today we trace that road from the beginning, from the edicts of Caesar, through English chests of promissory notes, Spanish inquisitorial pyres, Polish taverns, all the way to the wharves of New Amsterdam. Without censorship, without whitewashing anyone. Because in this story, no side has clean hands. To understand what happened in medieval Europe, you have to go back more than 1,000 years, to Rome. 47 years before the Common Era, Julius Caesar is fighting a war in Egypt. He needs allies in the east. He gets them. Hyrcanus II, the Jewish ruler of Judea, and Antipater, his chief advisor, provide military support. Caesar knew how to return a favour, not with cash, with privileges. Josephus, a Jewish historian from the 1st century who switched sides to Rome after the revolt, quotes in his Antiquities of the Jews a series of edicts issued by Caesar and the Senate. It is a monumental history of the Jewish people, written for a Roman audience, and that is precisely what makes it so valuable. Josephus was writing for Romans, not for rabbis. The documents he cites form the foundation of something that would fuel Jewish commercial success for the next 2,000 years, and Christian fury at that success. Caesar granted Jews the right to their own judicial jurisdiction. He exempted them from service in the legions, officially on account of the Sabbath and dietary laws. He guaranteed the right to free assembly, while the rest of the empire was subject to bans on secret associations. And he enabled the legal export of bullion from every province to Jerusalem. The temple tax collected from the entire diaspora, while for any other citizen, illegal export of money abroad was punishable by death. Looking at this from the perspective of an ordinary Roman gives you a picture that rarely appears in academic studies. You are a legionary. You have served 20 years. Your neighbour, a Jew, has not served a single day because he holds an exemption from Caesar himself. He has his own court, which you cannot enter. He exports gold abroad to fund his temple, while you face death for the illegal export of bullion. And he gathers with his people at meetings that would be illegal for everyone else. Legally, in your city, right under your nose. That legionary's anger was not irrational. It was exactly the kind of anger you would expect from a man who sees the rules of the game not applying equally to everyone. Cicero, in a courtroom speech from 59 years before the Common Era, gives us evidence of that allergy. He is defending an official accused of confiscating Jewish gold in Asia Minor, and at one point he deliberately lowers his voice. He admits it himself. He speaks more quietly, so as not to provoke the Jewish crowd at the public assembly. People who, he says, know how to exert effective pressure at public gatherings. Courtroom rhetoric? Sure. But rhetoric needs a grain of truth to work. The Jewish mercantile elite in Rome, not the entire diaspora, but its upper layer, the wealthiest merchants and community leaders, was a powerful, organised, rights-conscious interest group that actively enforced those rights. These were not defenceless refugees. This was a highly effective trade network, literate in a society of illiterates, connected from Alexandria to Hispania, operating within a legal framework no other group possessed. And this network played hardball. It applied pressure at assemblies. It forced favourable decisions. It exported capital on a massive scale from provinces where other citizens were subject to strict currency controls. At the same time, this same community could be expelled from the city by decree of a single emperor, and was. Emperor Claudius did it without blinking. An ordinary Jewish craftsman in Antioch or Alexandria benefited from the elite's privileges about as much as a Roman commoner benefited from senatorial contracts, which is to say, not at all. From the outside, though, from the perspective of a legionary or a bureaucrat, you saw one group, not its layers. Tacitus, the Roman historian writing at the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries, in the 5th book of his History of the Empire, wrote a sentence that would be repeated for 2,000 years. Among themselves, unshakable loyalty and ready compassion, but towards all others, hostile hatred. Tacitus was generalizing and oversimplifying. The refusal to eat with pagans came from dietary law, not from hatred. But Tacitus did not live in a vacuum. He lived in a city where he saw a community closed in on itself, refusing to participate in public religious life, running separate courts. That it stemmed from religious law rather than contempt, that explanation makes sense from a distance of 2,000 years. For a Roman standing right next to them, it made none. And that outside perception shaped attitudes for centuries. Then comes catastrophe. 70 of the Common Era. The Roman general Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, captures Jerusalem. The temple burns. Vespasian did not outlaw Judaism. That would have been economic suicide. He redirected the revenue stream. The temple tax, 2 drachmas per year, had gone to the temple. Now the fiscus Judaicus, the special Jewish tax, directed it to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Deliberate and brutal humiliation. Rome expanded the tax base in the way only a scrupulous empire can. The old tax had been paid by adult men between the ages of 20 and 50. Roman administration imposed the fiscus judaicus on absolutely everyone: men, women, children from the age of 3, even Jewish slaves up to the age of 62. Ostraca, clay shards serving as tax receipts from Edfu in Upper Egypt, document this in black and white. Under Emperor Domitian, successor to Titus, a 90-year-old man was stripped naked in a public square to check whether he was circumcised and force the tax from him. That is how the Roman biographer Suetonius describes it. The next emperor, Nerva, dismantled the informer system. He even struck a propaganda coin announcing the end of slanders connected to the Jewish tax. The tax itself, though, survived. Once launched, the racket of fiscal isolation proved too profitable. Incidentally, 1,000 years later, the same scheme would return in Poland, a tax imposed on an entire community, collected by their own elite, with penalties for non-payment. Different century, different continent, same mechanism. But more on that later. The final act, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the last great Jewish uprising against Rome. It lasted 4 years, starting in 132 of the Common Era. The Roman senator and historian Cassius Dio reports 580,000 dead, 50 fortresses razed. The numbers are probably exaggerated, the scale of destruction beyond dispute. Jerusalem becomes Aelia Capitolina. Jews are banned from entering. What remains is a network of trade contacts in every port of the Mediterranean, literacy, and religious law that holds the community together. No temple, no army, no state. You have trade and the Torah. With those tools, the diaspora enters the Middle Ages, and medieval Europe, poor, illiterate, looks at these strangers who can read, count, and earn with a mixture of admiration and mounting fury. A Christian craftsman rose at dawn, worked until dusk at the weaving loom, and barely made ends meet. And then he went for a loan to a man who lived better, ate better, and answered to a different court. He did not need a sermon about the killers of Christ. The anger grew on its own. Before we get into specific countries and dates, I need to explain the arrangement without which all these expulsions look like outbursts of irrational hatred. And they were not irrational. Brutal, yes. Cruel, beyond question. Calculated, always. Medieval canon law, the law of the Catholic Church binding on Christians in moral and economic matters, defined usury in absolute terms. Anything charged on a loan above the principal is a sin, punishable by excommunication. Halakha, Jewish religious law, forbade charging interest to a fellow Jew, Deuteronomy chapters 20 and 21, but explicitly permitted lending at interest to non-Jews. And it was precisely this double standard, Christians cannot lend, Jews can, that created a trap no one could escape. Europe needed credit for cathedrals, crusades, trade. The only group that could legally provide that credit was the Jews. And a second side of this mechanism needs to be stated immediately. Jews did not choose money lending because they enjoyed it. They chose it because they could do nothing else. Bans on owning land, bans on guild membership, bans on holding public office, in many regions, bans on farming. A chain of restrictions that systematically cut off access to every other form of livelihood. Money lending was not a Jewish choice. It was the only window the system left open. Rulers deliberately maintained this monopoly because they themselves profited from it. And this is the moment the whole structure starts to resemble a kind of financial pyramid, except instead of naive investors at the bottom, you have peasants and craftsmen. In the middle, Jewish bankers who think they are earning, and at the top, a king who knows he can seize everything at any moment. And that knowledge is his greatest asset. The Jew accumulates capital from the lower classes. The king levies a tax on the Jew lends again, and round it goes. What did this look like from the bottom? Interest rates on the Jewish lending market in the 14th century Holy Roman Empire reached 86% per year. An economist would say, risk premium, and the economist would be right. But a knight sitting in a cold castle, staring at a contract that says, for 50 marks borrowed in winter, he will owe 90 by summer, or lose the land his family has held for 4 generations. That knight was not thinking in terms of risk premiums. He saw a man who came, placed a purse on the table, dictated terms, and left, and half a year later came back for his ancestral land. All right, maybe I am dramatizing slightly. Not every loan ended in the loss of land. Most were probably repaid on time. But the ones that were not stayed in the memory for generations. And those are the ones that fueled the hatred. Italian bankers from Lombardy and Frenchmen from Cahors. Christians sidestepping the usury ban under the guise of contractual penalties took the safe loans to great families. Jewish financiers were left with the highest risk market. Risk drove up interest rates. Interest rates generated anger. Anger sought an outlet. The church eventually noticed this itself. In the second half of the 15th century, public lending houses called Monti di Pietà began appearing across Italy, offering low-interest loans, officially to free the poor from usurers. The preambles of their charters declared openly that their purpose was the destruction of the perfidious Jews, a holy cause and the elimination of competition in one sentence. And one more thing, because this needs to be said bluntly. Not all Jewish bankers were cogs in someone else's machine. The upper layer, a few dozen, maybe a few hundred people in all of England, were tough, ruthless financiers who made fortunes from other people's poverty and knew it perfectly well. The rest of the Jewish population, small traders, craftsmen, the destitute, lived in the shadow of those same financiers and paid the same taxes. Aaron of Lincoln was as distant to them as King Henry. A poor Jew from Norwich left behind not a single document. Aaron of Lincoln, probably the wealthiest man in 12th century England in terms of liquid assets. Fortune estimated at £100,000. He financed St Albans Abbey, the cathedrals at Lincoln and Peterborough, with 9 Cistercian monasteries on top. Sounds like a philanthropist. The thing is, that money came from interest squeezed from hundreds of debtors, many of whom never climbed out of debt. Aaron prospered spectacularly at the expense of people drowning in a spiral of obligation. After his death, the crown seized his entire estate. A special department was created at the Exchequer, the Scacarium of Aaron, handling over 400 debtors. Over 400 people who suddenly learned that their creditor was now the king himself, and the king would not negotiate. Aaron of York, son of Jos, who died in the massacre at York in 1190, one of the bloodiest pogroms in English history. 150 Jews barricaded themselves in the castle tower. Most took their own lives to avoid falling into the hands of the mob. The rest were killed trying to surrender. The son rebuilt his father's fortune from scratch, the largest Jewish financier of the 13th century. 1/3 of the region's credit market in the hands of one man. He paid enormous taxes. But those taxes were a fraction of the profits, until the crown demanded everything. By the middle of the 13th century, Arran was ruined. And Licoricia of Winchester, she took over the business after her husband, operated independently in the financial market in an era when women typically had no access to finance. Murdered. Stabbed. No one was convicted. Servi camerae regis, servants of the royal chamber. Not a metaphor, a legal institution. In England, in the Holy Roman Empire, in Bohemia, the same formula repeated for centuries, like a mantra. Jews and all their possessions belong to the king. In the Golden Bull, the constitutional charter governing the structure of the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Charles IV specified, with their bodies and their assets. Bodies, not just their portfolios. A human being as an entry in the Treasury's balance sheet. The triangle that drove the tragedy. The monarch at the top, creating the Jewish community as a fiscal buffer. Jews in the middle, enjoying protection, but defenceless against the monarch himself. And at the bottom, peasants, craftsmen, knights, who saw the Jews as a privileged instrument of royal oppression. And they were right. Jews were indeed privileged, in the same sense that a racehorse is privileged, fed better than a peasant's ox, but with a rider on its back and a whip overhead. Judicial immunity, a credit monopoly, and total dependence on the whim of a monarch who could seize everything at any moment. From a distance of 7 centuries, you can see it was a trap. From the courtyard where a debt-ridden craftsman stood, all he could see was the privilege. King John of England. 1210. Bristol. John demanded 66,000 marks from the Jewish leaders. Abraham of Bristol refused to pay 10,000. They pulled out 1 tooth per day for 7 days until he agreed. The chronicler Roger of Wendover, a monk from St Albans Abbey, recorded it without comment. Under the doctrine of servi camerae, this was not a violation of law. It was the enforcement of property rights. Under Henry III, John's son, the treasury drained the Jewish community almost every year. Nearly 50 levies over the course of his reign. You wonder there was anything left to collect. At one point, he demanded 1/3 of all movable property, and when that was still not enough, he pledged the entire Jewish community to his brother, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, as collateral for a loan. He pledged people, like a horse or a fortified tower. Against this background, the Magna Carta. Clauses 10 and 11, restricting the accumulation of interest on debts owed to Jews after the death of the debtor, protecting widows and minors. The barons did not demand this out of philanthropy. They demanded it because their ancestral estates were disappearing in spirals of debt, and the crown was seizing lands after the deaths of Jewish creditors. And to be fair to the barons, they were not simply greedy aristocrats looking for a pretext. Many of them watched their sons inherit not estates, but debts that grew year after year. They watched knights' widows left penniless because the entire dowry went to cover interest. Those Magna Carta clauses were not an act of anti-Semitism. They were an act of desperation by people who felt the system was consuming them from the inside. Both clauses were removed from every later edition, erased. By the end of the 13th century, the Jewish community had been squeezed dry. Edward I, needing funds for his campaigns in Wales, levied another 12,500 marks, then 1/3 of all assets. When the community could no longer pay, its usefulness to the apparatus of state had come to an end. The Statutum de Judaismo of 1275, a total ban on usury. Theoretical permission for agriculture and crafts, torpedoed by hostile guilds. And again, the Christian craftsmen who blocked Jews from entering guilds did not do so purely out of hatred. They did it for the same reason any cartel defends its barriers to entry, because a new player on the market threatens their bread. A poll tax of 3 pence and a yellow badge. A moment on that badge, because its history tells you more than many a treatise. The idea was not English. The Fourth Lateran Council, the great assembly of bishops in Rome in 1215, ordered the visual distinction of Jews from Christians. England implemented it first in Europe, 3 years later, at the urging of a papal legate. The first badge was white, cloth or parchment, 2 tablets of the Decalogue on the chest. An assembly of English bishops in Oxford a few years later specified the dimensions, and only Edward I's statute changed the colour to yellow. 6 inches by 3, made of felt, in the shape of the 2 tablets of Moses, mandatory for everyone over the age of 7. Yellow was no accident. In medieval symbolism, it signified treachery, falsehood, disease. From white cloth to yellow felt, 3 generations was all it took for a mark of identification to become an instrument of humiliation. And from Edward's yellow felt to the yellow star of the Third Reich, the line runs straight. 700 years, the same logic. Stripped of legal income, the community slid into a grey economy. Coin clipping, shaving the edges of coins, melting the filings into silver. On the 17th of November, 1278, a simultaneous police operation across all of England, over 1,100 arrested, between 269 and 300 hanged. 29 Christians too, for a show of impartiality. And in 1290, the Edict of Expulsion. The Crown keeps the houses, synagogues, cemeteries, promissory notes. Parliament votes a tax of £116,000. The Church kicks in a tithe in gratitude. The gap in the credit market is immediately filled by the Knights Templar and Italian bankers, circumventing the usury ban under the guise of handling fees. Money has no religion. It never did. Chapter 3. The Western Dominoes. The Great Expulsions. Before we move to France, a brief detour, because between the English edict and the French one, something happened that is rarely discussed, and it explains how easily hatred crossed over from the economic level to the cultural one. Paris, around 1242. In public squares, 24 full cartloads of Talmudic manuscripts burn. Not promissory notes, not account ledgers. Manuscripts. Priceless monuments of religious and legal thought, copied by hand across generations. The operation was initiated by the clergy, inspired by Nicholas Donin, a convert from Judaism who convinced the Pope that the Talmud contained blasphemies, and approved by King Louis IX of France, the same man the Church later canonized as a saint. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, one of the most important Jewish religious authorities of the era, wrote an elegy after the event. Sha'ali Serufa, ask, you who were burned in fire. It is recited to this day on Tisha B'Av, alongside the lamentations for the destruction of the temples. In Jewish memory, those burning cartloads of manuscripts stand beside the burning of Jerusalem. This was not an economic act. No one profited. This was cultural terror, the destruction of an adversary's knowledge to weaken them at a level deeper than the wallet. A society that watched the public burning of foreign books was already prepared for the burning of foreign homes. And then, foreign people. 16 years after the English edict, France. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, faced the same problem as Edward on a larger scale. And to be fair to Philip, he was not a madman. He was the ruler of a state going bankrupt. The defeat at Courtrai in Flanders, where Flemish craftsmen destroyed the flower of French chivalry, cost the crown not only prestige, but mountains of money. A conflict with the papacy, currency devaluation, unrest in Paris. The treasury empty, an army to maintain, Flanders to recover. In that situation, every monarch looks for someone who can be flayed without risk of rebellion. Jews were the perfect target, wealthy, defenceless, despised. On the 21st of June 1306, secret instructions to field officers. A month later, synchronized arrests across the entire kingdom. The official chronicler from the Abbey of Saint-Denis reports around 100,000 people thrown into prisons, then forced to leave the country within a month. They could take the clothes on their backs and enough money for one day's travel. Philip wanted something Edward had not needed on such a scale: Jewish account books. He seized promissory notes and debt registers, appointed himself the creditor of all Christian debtors of Jewish financial institutions. And there is a detail here that says more about the nature of the operation than the entire edict. To decipher the Hebrew accounting systems, the royal officials simply could not read them. The commissioners forced selected Jews to remain in the country and manage the confiscated registers under threat of punishment. You throw the bankers onto the street. Their accountants you keep under arrest, because without them, your loot is a pile of incomprehensible symbols. The reaction of the street was preserved in a Parisian rhymed chronicle of the period. The people of Paris initially cheered. At last, the ones who had been draining us are gone. The disappointment came fast. In place of the old moneylenders appeared royal tax collectors with armed escorts. Promissory notes were now enforced on behalf of the crown, with a determination Jewish bankers had never dreamed of. People understood. Debt does not vanish along with the creditor. Only the hand that collects it changes. And the new hand carried a sword. Philip repeated the trick a year later, striking at the Knights Templar. The same scheme: charges of heresy, confiscation of assets. 2 shots by the same king at the 2 largest creditors of the crown. Philip's son 9 years later invited the surviving Jews back, on a 12-year paid privilege. The next king expelled them for good at the end of the 14th century. Renewable budget fuel. Now Spain. 1391. Ferran Martinez, the Archdeacon of Écija in Andalusia, had been running an anti-Jewish campaign for 13 years. He ignored orders from both the king and the archbishop. The deaths of both, in quick succession, gave him a free hand. On the 6th of June, a pogrom in Seville. Around 4,000 killed. The violence spread to over 70 cities. Modern estimates speak of 50,000 killed and 200,000 forced into baptism. The Spanish Jewish community, then the largest in the world, shrank by 1/3. We have a first-hand Jewish account. Hasdai Crescas, a rabbi and philosopher from Barcelona, wrote a letter that autumn to the Jewish community in Avignon. He described the pogrom in Barcelona, in which he lost his only son. Around 100 people killed, the rest took shelter in a fortress. Crescas wrote with grief but with precision. This is not rhetoric, this is a document. The violence did not touch only the poor, it struck the intellectual elite, rabbis, librarians, scribes. Synagogues were burned with manuscripts still inside. And now the paradox. The mass conversion removed the one obstacle that had kept Jews away from real power. Conversos, new Christians, advanced rapidly. Solomon Halevi, a rabbi, became Pablo de Santa Maria, Bishop of Burgos and royal advisor. His sons took up the next dignities. They began to dominate the treasury administration, city councils, cathedral chapters. They married into Castilian and Aragonese nobility. But here you have to give voice to the other side. A Castilian nobleman. 6 generations of Christian ancestors. His grandfather fought the Moors. His father served the crown. And suddenly his mayor is the son of a rabbi. His bishop, a convert. And his daughter has received a marriage proposal from a family that 20 years ago was observing the Sabbath on Friday evenings. That these people were competent does not change the fact that the social upheaval was violent. That nobleman did not hate the conversos because he was stupid. He hated them because they had displaced him. Add to this crypto-Judaism, and this is not an invention of the Inquisitors. Many conversos led double lives. Officially, masses, baptisms, pork on display. At home, the Sabbath, circumcision, prayers from hidden manuscripts. We know of such cases from Inquisition trials in the New World. The memoirs of one of the accused, Luis de Carvajal the Younger, describe underground networks in detail. Some conversions were sincere, some were a farce, and no one on the outside could tell one from the other. In 1449, Pero de Sarmiento, mayor of Toledo and leader of an anti-converso revolt, established the Sentencia Estatuto, the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. For the first time in Europe, someone wrote into law that baptism was not enough, that blood mattered, not faith, that you could be the most devout Catholic in Castile and be denied office because your great-grandfather attended a synagogue. The statutes spread across all of Spain and remained in force for over 400 years. And at the same time, the very same crown that established the Inquisition to root out Judaizers depended on Jewish financial genius for its war machine. Abraham Sr., chief rabbi of Castile and treasurer of the Santa Hermandad, the crown's armed militia. Isaac Abravanel, a financier who funded over 1/10 of the loan to the Portuguese crown and managed treasury operations in Castile. Together, they financed the war for Granada. And a few months after victory, the Edict of Expulsion. Senior, an 80-year-old, accepted baptism. His godparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, in person. Abravanel refused and chose exile. In exile, he wrote commentaries on the prophetic books. He interpreted the catastrophe not as a financial defeat, but as divine punishment and a promise of redemption. Not all Jewish actors in this story thought exclusively in terms of money. And now Columbus. The myth of Isabella's jewels is a 19th century fiction. The necklace was already pawned to the alderman of Valencia. The entire financing of the first voyage was the work of Luis de Santangel, a third-generation converso, treasurer of the Crown of Aragon, a man whose family the Inquisition had systematically destroyed. A cousin burned alive, a father-in-law burned, another relative beheaded, Sant'Angel put up or arranged a loan of over 1 million maravedis, roughly half the cost of the expedition. Columbus's letter from his first voyage was addressed to Sant'Angel and to the treasurer of the Kingdom of Aragon, Gabriel Sanchez. Every major promoter of the voyage was of Jewish descent. There is a theory that Sant'Angel knew about the Alhambra decree before it was announced, and that this is why he pushed so hard for the expedition, seeing in it, well, that is speculation, and I have no sources for it, so let us stick to what we know. For many of them, the New World was not merely a financial speculation, it was the promise of a place beyond the reach of the Inquisition, and it was an investment with expected returns. And here is the punchline: the foundation of an empire built with the money of the very people that empire was expelling. These people did not do it out of altruism, they did it out of desperation, cold calculation, and the drive to profit. 3 great expulsions: England, France, Spain. Every time an empty treasury and a confiscated fortune, and a wave of flight eastward, to the German lands, to Poland, where rulers needed exactly what the West had thrown out. In the East, though, different traps lay in wait. Strasbourg, the 14th of February, 1349. On the city's Jewish cemetery, on specially erected wooden platforms, around 2,000 people are burned alive. Women, men, children. Mercy was shown to those who accepted baptism on the spot, and to some infants pulled from the flames against their parents' will. The fact that demolishes the official story of a spontaneous outbreak of panic. In February of 1349, the Black Death had not yet reached Strasbourg. The plague was hundreds of kilometers away. It arrived in the summer, killing 16,000 residents. 2,000 people were murdered for a plague that had not yet come. Let us step back. Europe has a problem it cannot comprehend. The plague is consuming between 30 and 60% of the population. Nobody knows why. And someone notices that in the Jewish quarters, at least in some cities, fewer people are dying. I need to be honest here. The question is scientifically contested. The 14th century German scholar Konrad von Megenberg wrote explicitly that in Vienna, so many Jews died of the plague that they had to enlarge the cemetery. But even the perception of lower mortality, confirmed or not, was enough to light the fuse. Why might the perception have had a real basis? Halakha, Jewish religious law, required hand washing before every meal, while the Christian neighbour's last hand wash after leaving the latrine was more likely accidental. Jewish women went to the mikveh, the ritual bath. Before Passover, homes were scrubbed to bare walls, and rats lost their food supply. There is also a genetic hypothesis. Modern researchers have found that the familial Mediterranean fever mutation, carried by 1 in 5 Ashkenazi Jews, may have conferred resistance to plague. Genes that protected against the pestilence, and that protection became a death sentence. The origin of the accusations is precisely documented. Château de Chillon on Lake Geneva, in what is today Switzerland, autumn of 1348. Jews tortured into confessions testified under duress that a rabbi from Chambéry had given them poison to put in the wells. The protocols were copied from city to city, through Switzerland, down the Rhine into the German lands. The transmission mechanism of confessions extracted under torture created a chain of self-fulfilling propaganda. Pope Clement VI tried to stop it. In a special decree, he argued that the plague afflicted the Jews themselves so they could not be its agents. He was ignored, because the Pope was far away and the debts were close. Jacob von Königshoven, the archivist of Strasbourg, left behind a sentence that should hang over every discussion of this period. Money really did kill the Jews. Had they been poor, and had the feudal lords not been in debt to them, they would not have been burned. Königshoven described what happened after the massacre. Immediate break-ins to the homes of the murdered, systematic destruction of promissory notes and debt instruments, cash divided among craftsmen and councillors. Some craftsmen donated their share to the cathedral on the advice of their confessors. They could murder 2,000 people, but they could not spend stolen gold without absolution. And you know what is worst in all of this? Not the fire itself, not the screaming, not even the infants ripped from the flames against their parents' will so they could be baptized before they died. The worst part is what came the next morning. Because the next morning, Strasbourg carried on. Market stalls opened, butchers went back to the slaughterhouse, tanners to the tannery, the bishop said Mass. The smoke from the Jewish cemetery had not yet cleared, and life returned to normal. 2,000 people burned, and the city did not even break stride. Because if you have a slaughter one day and go back to work the next without a scratch on your conscience, it means you are either numbed to the core or a psychopath. Or that you live in an age where a human life is worth less than a promissory note. One does not rule out the other. The sequence of events reveals premeditation. On the 8th of February, a conference in Benfeld, a small town near Strasbourg, where Bishop Berthold II of Strasbourg and the feudal lords of Alsace agreed to dispose of the Jews. On the 9th and 10th, the overthrow of the city council that had been protecting the Jews as a source of tax revenue. The guilds of butchers and tanners staged a coup. On the 13th, arrests. On the 14th, the burning. The money was divided among craftsmen. Debts cancelled in a single stroke. Properties passed to new owners before the ashes had cooled. Strasbourg was not an exception. The wave rolled across the entire continent. In Speyer, Jews murdered, some committed self-immolation. The bodies were placed in wine barrels and sent down the Rhine. In Freiburg, all burned except for the 12 wealthiest, reserved exclusively for the purpose of seizing their riches. And a digression here, because from Erfurt in Thuringia comes a detail discovered 650 years later. In 1998, during construction work, a treasure was unearthed. Coins, jewellery, silver vessels. Probably hidden by a Jewish merchant before the pogrom. Buried by a man who knew he was about to die, and hoped that someone, perhaps a son, perhaps a grandson, would come back for it. No one came back. In Mainz, the largest Jewish community in Europe, Jews fought back, killing around 200 attackers. The mob regrouped, an estimated 6,000 killed, mass self-immolation. In Nuremberg, over 500 murdered. Emperor Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire issued a letter granting absolution in advance from all responsibility before the massacre had taken place, though it should be added that Charles was fighting a civil war and had no real control over half the cities in the empire. He did not so much authorize the pogroms as peddle pardons from a position of impotence, taking money to legalize what he could not prevent. It does not make him less guilty, it makes him more pathetic. Later, when revenue dropped, because there was no one left to tax, Charles began encouraging Jews to return. Strasbourg, despite an oath of a 200-year ban, readmitted them in less than 20 years after the massacre. Modern economists took a map of the Holy Roman Empire and counted. Of 325 cities with documented Jewish settlements, 235 experienced pogroms, 72%. The cleric and chronicler Heinrich Truchsess von Diessenhofen summed it up. In the course of 1 year, all the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burned and killed. Jewish bankers in those cities were not small-time savers. They were powerful financiers on whom entire regional budgets depended. Their murder was not an attack on the poor. It was a radical restructuring of debt. Extermination as controlled bankruptcy. The fastest and cheapest in 14th century Europe, although controlled is too strong a word. More often, local elites lit the fuse and then tried to steer a fire that was spreading on its own. Control is a myth we tell ourselves after the fact. The West expelled, the East took in. That is the popular version. Paradisus Judeorum, paradise of the Jews. And against the backdrop of England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, Poland genuinely looked like a sanctuary. The thing is, that tolerance was not unconditional. It had a price, and both sides profited from it. First, coins, the end of the 12th century. Mieszko III, known as Mieszko the Old, a duke ruling Wielkopolska, one of the fragmented Polish principalities, and fighting to reclaim power, hands over his mints in Gniezno and Kalisz to Jewish financial experts. They had little choice, to be fair. In the Poland of the Piast dynasty, the occupations legally open to them could be counted on one hand. The mint workers strike bracteates, thin silver coins with Hebrew inscriptions, over 50 types. On one, Mieszko, King of Poland, written in Hebrew letters. On another, a bracha, a blessing, right next to the image of a cross. Numismatists have shown that a Jewish engraver on one of the bracteates deliberately replaced the crosses atop towers with orbs, a conscious cultural act etched in silver. Not rebellion, not provocation. They simply filtered the official symbol through their own sensibility. A small thing. In the 13th century, that small thing could cost you your life. The key to the system, renovatio monetae. The periodic withdrawal of old coins and their exchange for new ones at a fraudulent rate. 3 old for 2 new. Essentially the same thing modern central banks do when they print money and dilute the value of savings. Except in the 13th century, nobody pretended it was monetary policy. A hidden inflation tax, bypassing the restrictions imposed by a resistant aristocracy. A peasant goes to the Jewish mint, hands over 3 coins, gets 2 worse ones back, covered in foreign letters. The anger hits the minter. The duke counts his profits in the palace. The Jewish mint workers knew what they were doing. They bought the minting contracts because they saw a profit in it. They earned, not as much as the duke, but they earned. Nobody dragged them to the mint by the sleeve. They went because it paid better than anything else they were allowed to do. And when a peasant from Gniezno looked at a coin with Hebrew letters, for which he received less than he gave, he did not care who designed the system. He cared who sat behind the counter. In 1264, the Statute of Kalisz, a charter issued by Duke Boleslav the Pious of Wielkopolska, regulating the status of Jews. 36 articles. Separate judicial jurisdiction, freedom of worship and trade, protection against accusations of ritual murder. Casimir the Great, one of Poland's most celebrated medieval kings, extended it to the whole country 70 years later. A Jewish Magna Carta, with the difference that the English one protected the people from the king, and this one protected the minority from the people. The Council of Four Lands, Va'ad Arba Aratzot. From the end of the 16th century, the state treasury imposed a collective tax sum on all Jews. The division and collection fell to the Jewish leadership. The same trick, incidentally, that English kings had been using 300 years earlier. You throw one sum at the entire community and say, "Sort it out yourselves." 4 provinces, Wielkopolska and Małopolska, in western and southern Poland, Ruthenia in the southeast, and Volhynia in the east. Lithuania joined half a century later with its own separate council. Assemblies held in Lublin and Yaroslav, major trade fair towns in the east of the country. And here we need to speak plainly. The Vaad was a strict oligarchy. Representation was limited exclusively to the wealthiest, financiers, rabbis, the communal patriciate. Voting rights belonged to those who had paid the settlement fee known as hazaka, the right to permanent residence in the community, purchased for cash. The rest, and the rest was the overwhelming majority, had no say. And I need to pause here, because this picture is easy to distort. When I say Jews in Poland, the image that comes to mind is Aaron of Lincoln, or a leaseholder running contracts across half a province. But most Polish Jews were small craftsmen, porters, cobblers patching old shoes, dealers in second-hand goods, beggars, people barely making ends meet in overcrowded market towns. The oligarchy of the Vaad exploited them just as effectively as the great landowners exploited the peasants. Cherem, total religious excommunication and social economic exclusion, fell on those who did not pay. If you did not pay, you were cast out of the community. No Jewish merchant could trade with you. No Jewish family could speak to you. No rabbi would bury your dead. And if there was resistance, the Polish state's own troops were called in to deal with the disobedient community. Jewish elites asking Christian soldiers to enforce taxes on the Jewish poor. Sounds harsh? Because it is. That is how the historian Israel Halperin described it in his publication of the Protocols of the Council of Four Lands. The Vaad also financed hospitals, schools, and dowries for poor girls. The same institution that crushed dissent maintained a welfare network that Christian towns could envy. 2 faces of one machine. The Vaad even controlled what could be printed. No book could reach the market without the Lublin seal of approval. The Sabbateans, followers of a false messiah from the 17th century, and the Frankists, disciples of another self-proclaimed prophet, Jacob Frank, every internal dissident was hounded, with a determination many a bishop would have envied. And on the outside, a network of lobbyists known as Stadlanim. Their job was simple: bribe the Polish magnates, the great aristocratic landowners, to block legislation restricting Jewish trade. A bribe of 80,000 zloty to the Tsarist commissioner Novosiltsov, overseeing the Kingdom of Poland after the partitions, is documented, and it was not an exception. It was the cost of doing business. The Vaad collapsed in the second half of the 18th century. It had taken out astronomical loans from Catholic monasteries and magnates to pay taxes to the crown. The state realised the central body had become an indebted black hole and liquidated its autonomy. The end of the state within a state, driven not by tolerance, but by the balance sheet. Now the Arenda, the lease system. In the eastern borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, vast territories in what is today Ukraine and Belarus, inhabited predominantly by Orthodox Ruthenian peasants, the Polish magnates entrusted the management of their estates to wealthy Jews. Arendars, leaseholders, leased mills, slaughterhouses, toll bridges, forests, and above all, the propination right, the exclusive monopoly on the production and sale of alcohol. By the middle of the 18th century, 85% of Polish Jews were connected to the alcohol trade. Now let us step into the shoes of a Ruthenian serf, because without that perspective, this history is just dry mechanics. An Orthodox peasant farmer on the estate of the Wiśniowiecki family, one of the most powerful magnate dynasties in the eastern borderlands. His lord, a Catholic, a Pole, lives in Warsaw or Paris. The peasant has never seen him. The person he sees every day comes to collect the rent, sells him vodka that he is obliged by law to buy, collects tolls at the bridge, tallies penalties for arrears. And that person is a Jew. Speaks a different language, dresses differently, prays differently, eats different food. On Sunday, the peasant goes to his Orthodox church, and the priest tells him, "These people murdered Christ." And then he goes back to the tavern, because the tavern is the only warm place in the village, and pays for vodka he cannot afford to the same man the priest just called a murderer of Christ. That peasant is not stupid, and he is not evil by nature. He is trapped. And the only face that trap wears is the face of the leaseholder. And the Jewish Arendar himself? The specific type, a wealthy leaseholder, not a small-time tavern keeper, has paid an enormous rent up front for the contract. He needs to recoup the investment fast. If the peasant does not pay, the Arendar loses his fortune. The magnates, "I understand, the poor people have no money," did not exist. The contract was merciless in both directions. Though Arendar is a broad term, ranging from the wealthy leaseholder running an entire cluster of estates, down to a wretch running a tavern in a muddy village who himself barely made ends meet, and from whom the magnate's agent extracted rent with the same ruthlessness he applied to the peasants. The upper layer of Arendars knew what they were doing. They knew they were selling vodka to people who could not afford it. They knew they were collecting rent from people who could barely survive. That most of the money went further up, to the magnate, to the crown, is a fact. But the Arendar was not a pipe through which money flowed painlessly. He was a person, standing face to face with another person, and taking the last thing that person had. And it was his face the peasant remembered, not the face of a magnate in Paris. The keys to the churches, myth or fact? After the research of historian Judith Kalick of the Hebrew University, the physical leasing of an Orthodox church as a place of worship never appeared in surviving contracts. The motif was planted in the literature by a Polish Catholic cleric named Paweł Russell in a pamphlet from 1649. A search of the archives of regional tribunals, though, uncovered a grain of dark truth. Magnates ordered the locking of Orthodox churches as fiscal blackmail, and delegated the enforcement of those orders to their Jewish agents. Court records from the ecclesiastical tribunal in Kaunas, Lithuania, from the second half of the 17th century, Two Jewish creditors formally swear off attempts to seize keys from a drunken subordinate. The very fact that such a trial took place proves that such situations occurred. There was no systematic monopoly. There were incidents. Incidents that turned into legend, and legend into justification for massacres. Incidentally, there is another conflict here that had nothing to do with peasants in the borderlands, and everything to do with merchants in the cities. In most Polish royal cities, from the 15th century onward, there existed a law with an ugly name: Privilegium de non tolerandis Judaeis, literally, the right not to tolerate Jews. Historians for years explained it as pure xenophobia and clerical influence, and the clergy did fan the flames. But when you look into the municipal records and guild documents, something far more prosaic emerges. Christian craft guilds in Krakow, Poznan, Lwów, Warsaw functioned like cartels. They fixed prices, limited production, controlled access to the market. The system worked as long as everyone played by the rules. The problem was that Jewish merchants and craftsmen did not follow those rules, because they could not join the guilds, so the guilds had no power over them. Jewish wholesalers sold cheaper, not out of cunning, but because they had no access to the guild pricing system and operated outside it. Faster, without the administrative overhead of guild elders. A 17th century Polish polemicist named Sebastian Michinski wrote in despair about Jewish merchants who lurk by every great Christian shop and turn away customers. And those Christian craftsmen, usually portrayed as a pack of xenophobes? A cobbler in Krakow who spent 20 years building his workshop, paying guild dues, respecting price limits, training apprentices, and then watched someone from the suburbs sell shoes at half the price, without any restrictions, without any dues, under the protection of a magnate. That cobbler had every right to feel cheated, not because his competitor was a Jew, because his competitor was playing by different rules. The cobbler did not see it that way though. He saw that he was losing to someone who did not play fair, who did not pay dues, who did not respect limits, who was not subject to the guild elders, who did not risk penalties for breaking the rules, and yet sold cheaper, faster, and closer to the customer, and who had a magnate behind him, shielding him from the town sheriff, while he, a cobbler with 20 years of experience, had no one behind him but a guild that was going bankrupt. And he dressed that frustration in theology, because that was easier than saying outright, "I am losing on the market." Christian guilds were losing that price war. The response was not reform, the response was buying, at great expense, royal privileges, banning Jews from trading within city walls. Krakow received such a privilege at the end of the 15th century, Warsaw shortly after. It did not work though, because the magnates, the same magnates who in the borderlands were leasing Arenda contracts, on the outskirts of cities created juridiki, private territories exempt from municipal jurisdiction. Jewish craftsmen settled in juridiki, produced goods without guild restrictions, and on market days brought them right to the city gates. Cheaper clothes, knives, fabrics, right under the noses of the guild-affiliated Christian merchants. That is how, for example, the Jewish district of Praga was born, on the far bank of the Vistula River, outside the walls of Royal Warsaw. The effect was predictable. The Christian guilds, ossified by regulation, went bankrupt, outcompeted by more agile rivals. The despair over lost market position was dressed in theological robes. It was easier to talk about blasphemers than to admit your system was inferior. Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack hetman who led the great uprising against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-17th century, told his people that the Poles had sold them into slavery in the hands of the accursed Jews. Nathan Hanover, a rabbi and eyewitness to the slaughter, described the events in a chronicle called Yeven Metsula, the Deep Mire, written a few years after. I read Hanover for the first time about 10 years ago and could not sleep. Not because of the descriptions of carnage, because of the tone. This man was writing about the end of his world in the same language an accountant uses for a balance sheet. Note, the end of his world, literally, described without a trace of emotion. People in the medieval and early modern era experience death differently than we do. Not better, not worse, differently. Nemiriv in Podolia, 6,000 dead. Tulchin, the Cossacks convinced the Poles that the hatred was directed only at the Jews. The Jews surrendered their weapons, 1,500 slaughtered. The Poles, shortly after. The scale? Sources diverge wildly. A Jewish chronicler, writing immediately after the events, gives 670,000, an obvious exaggeration. A modern demographic revision by the historian Shaul Stampfer dismantles those numbers. The entire Jewish population of Crown Ruthenia numbered around 40,000, so at most 50%, probably considerably less. Even 20,000 is a horror. Hanover, incidentally, is not a perfect source. Scholars have shown that he copied passages from earlier works and transposed events from one location to the description of another. An elegy, not a scholarly report, but the pain behind it was real. A jump of 200 years. On one side, 5 brothers from the Frankfurt ghetto building the first global banking network. On the other, millions of paupers from Jewish market towns fleeing onto ships to America. This is the history of the same people in the same century. The Jewish poor from the Pale of Settlement, the band of territory in the Western Russian Empire where Jews were legally confined, had as much in common with the Rothschilds as a Polish serf had with the great aristocratic dynasty of the Radziwiłls. The Rothschilds. I will start with the legend and add the uncomfortable truth that both sides prefer to skip. The legend. Nathan Mayer Rothschild supposedly learned the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo before the entire British government, deliberately caused a panic on the stock exchange, and bought Great Britain in a single day. The source of the legend, an anonymous pamphlet from 1846. The historian Niall Ferguson, in his monograph on the Rothschild family, verified the stock exchange archives. What he confirms, Nathan had the information 48 hours before the official courier. A private network of agents and fast ships. Genuine intelligence, not myth. What does not hold up? No deliberate manipulation, no engineered panic. Nathan reported the news to the Prime Minister, who did not believe him. Then he bought up discounted government bonds, a brilliant bet that victory would raise their value. Legal, shrewd, and that is all. The real source of Rothschild power was a monopoly on brokering government war loans. By the end of the 1830s, 50% of all European sovereign debt issuance. And here enters a figure that textbooks prefer not to discuss. Friedrich von Gentz, the right hand of Chancellor Metternich, the most powerful politician in Europe at the time, and architect of the post-Napoleonic order. Gentz wrote laws and controlled the press in Austria. Declassified correspondence shows he was on the Rothschild payroll, around 10,000 florins per year, more than he received officially from the emperor. For that money, he delivered to the bankers something worth more than gold: information. Who was negotiating with whom, where a war was being prepared, when an intervention was coming. The Rothschilds adjusted their bond positions in advance, before markets had time to react. And if some newspaper dared publish something unflattering, Gentz called the editor, personally. An encyclopedia article about the family, he wrote it himself. This is documented corruption at the highest level, of the same nature as the corruption of every other powerful interest group with a financial advantage. But when the family doing this carries the name Rothschild, in the 19th century, in a Europe feeding on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, it fuels propaganda machines the world has never seen. The corruption of other great banking houses generated scandals. With the Rothschilds, the same thing generated conspiracy theories that led to crematoria. The Austrian diplomat Prince Prokesh Osten wrote openly, "It is all a question of means and resources, and here what Rothschild says is decisive, and he will block the supply of money for a war." Salomon Rothschild, head of the Vienna branch, refused Austria a war loan because the stabilization of bonds yielded greater profits than conflict. That is not a conspiracy. That is a monopoly on credit. The effect, though, is the same: a private bank dictating the foreign policy of a sovereign state. Frankly, I am not sure whether this is still corruption or already a new world order. A state within a state look different now. Not separate courts and cemeteries as in the Middle Ages, but control over the budgets of great powers, exercised from an office at New Court in London, the Rothschild headquarters. And the protocols themselves? 100 years after Gentz's corruption, in Chisinau, the capital of Bessarabia, in what is today Moldova, after the pogrom of 1903, in which several dozen people were killed, the publisher of a local anti-Semitic newspaper printed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for the first time, a fabricated document purporting to describe a Jewish plan for world domination, in reality a plagiarism of an anti-Napoleonic satire from the 1860s. From Gentz's corruption to the Protocols, from fact to forgery, a straight line. And that forgery became one of the most potent propaganda weapons of the 20th century. At the same time, millions were fleeing onto ships. Not the Rothschilds, people with one set of clothes and a one-way ticket. Finale. The balance sheet of 2,000 years. September of 1654, Manhattan. A ship arrives in New Amsterdam, today's New York, carrying 23 Sephardic Jewish refugees from Recife, a Dutch colony in Brazil that has just surrendered to the Portuguese. Robbed by pirates, stripped of their capital, Peter Stuyvesant, director of the colony, an authoritarian Calvinist, confiscated the remnants of their property, auctioned it to cover transport debts, threw 2 of them in prison. He wrote to the board of the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam, demanding their expulsion. He called them frauds, usurers, enemies and blasphemers. He argued that tolerating Jews would destroy the Calvinist religious monopoly. And here, for the first time in this 2,000-year history, the mechanism jams. New Amsterdam was not a kingdom. It was a trading post of a joint stock company. And that company had Jewish shareholders in Amsterdam, elites expelled from Spain and Portugal who had been buying up stock. The company board's response is a document that should open every history of civil rights, and every history of corporate cynicism, because one does not exclude the other. I quote, We would like to fulfill your wishes that the new territories not be infected by people of the Jewish nation. However, upon deeper consideration, we note that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unjust, particularly given the considerable losses suffered by this nation, and also because of the significant capital they still have invested in shares of this company. We would like to get rid of the Jews, but the Jews are shareholders. For the first time in history, stock market capital proved a more effective shield than a papal bull or a statute of tolerance. Not because the board members were better people than Edward I, because they had different interests. The same company that protected Jewish refugees was simultaneously trading African slaves on a massive scale. Freedom for some did not mean freedom for all. It meant freedom for shareholders. The pattern was not universal, to be fair. Venice, Amsterdam, Poland for centuries proved that coexistence was possible, though never painless. But whenever the system broke down, it always ended the same way. From that group of refugees emerged Asa Levy, a butcher, probably a survivor of the Khmelnytsky massacres, who, 3 years after arriving, obtained the status of burgher, a full citizen of the city. One of 6 licensed butchers of New Amsterdam, with an exemption from the obligation to slaughter pigs. By the time he died, over 400 New Yorkers owed him money. From refugee to creditor. And the pattern repeats. A ruler needs money and brings in a minority, granting a safe conduct. A narrow elite of that minority accumulates capital, sometimes aggressively, sometimes ruthlessly, at the expense of those lower in the hierarchy. The majority lives in the shadow of that elite, sharing none of its wealth, only sharing its face, its language, and the hatred of those around it. The elite's capital generates envy. Envy generates propaganda, poisoned wells, keys to the churches, the protocols of the elders. Propaganda provides the pretext. The pretext enables confiscation. And when trouble comes, it is not the banker in the palace who pays. It is the tailor in the market town. And that is where this story ends. I have tried to tell it fairly, but if you disagree, the comments are open. Let me know if you want more. I can do a follow-up from New Amsterdam where we left off, all the way to the founding of the Jewish state.